All right, so are you hearing me well? Okay. All right, well, hi everyone. I'm Marianne. I am currently an incident handler at Bell Canada, which is in cybersecurity. If you don't know what incident handlers are, I am presenting today on cyber threat intelligence insight into ransomware attacks against Canadian healthcare. And you might be wondering what someone in a telecom is, why is she presenting on healthcare? Well, because when I did my master's degree, I focused heavily on cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, specifically in Canada. And I presented this last year at an event organized by Emerging Leaders Can Hack, where we were presented with a scenario of a hospital being a victim of a ransomware attack, where basically we needed to present our findings, the impacts, as well as our recommendations to a board of directors. However, today the presentation will be more focused on macro trends to present a better context for what healthcare in Canada faces when it comes to ransomware attacks. So first, what are ransomware attacks? Many of you probably know what it is, but basically it is when a threat actor will block access to tools, data, patients, and care information. That is often done by encrypting the data and making it inaccessible to legitimate users. The threat actors will then demand something in return, money, for the return of the service and data to the legitimate users. The main trends we see in this field is an increase in ransomware attacks against healthcare in the last few years. Actually, when it comes to cyber attacks, it is around 1,500 cyber attacks weekly against healthcare. So it is a pretty high number. When it comes to ransomware specifically, 60% of healthcare organizations have been hit in the last year. That is internationally. When it comes to Canada specifically, since 2015, at least 14 major cyber attacks have targeted health information systems. So it is not only an international problem, it definitely hits home and affects Canadians as well. I'd like to mention before I continue that numbers are not extremely reliable when it comes to cybersecurity, because who wants to admit that they've been hit by cyber attacks? Often organizations will admit when it comes out in the media. Yes. So why is this happening? Well, first we need to explore who the threat actors are. There are two main types, and the first one are state actors who will attack healthcare for the same reasons that they would during kinetic warfare, and that is to create fear, to attack critical infrastructure, to render the enemy unable to function. States will do that by sponsoring groups or sheltering them from international repercussions or consequences. The main actor we see in this field is actually Russia. You might have guessed it. China is also quite active, but not as much in terms of ransomware. They do target critical infrastructure, but not necessarily through the usage of ransomware. Here, it's important to mention that attribution is actually quite difficult. I say states, but it's often impossible to know for certain, and states will virtually always deny their involvement in these types of attacks. However, there are famous groups who are kind of famously known for being linked to a specific state, and yeah, it is quite known in the field, so that is why I mentioned these states. The second type of actors are cyber criminals. They can either be individuals or groups, not necessarily linked to a state. And they will use ransomware against healthcare because it's a huge lever. It's often successful for them, and money can easily be spent on retrieving the data. So it is quite lucrative. Actually, 40% of cases of ransomware end in the ransom being paid. And when it comes to like the financial cost of it, it averages around $3.3 million, the amount for ransomwares. So that leads me again to kind of the gains, financial gains, obviously. But also, even if the ransom isn't necessarily paid, threat actors might gain access to data they found along the way during their attacks and sell it on the dark web. Actually, medical records can sell for $1,000 on the dark web. That can be 100 times more valuable than credit card files for context. That can be resold for various usage to other actors. We can easily think of using that for blackmail, phishing, or further hacking. So we've seen the actors as well as the gains, what they gain in doing these types of attacks, but why are these specifically targeting healthcare in Canada? Well, because there are vulnerabilities inherent to the sector. We can think of the fact that in the last few years or maybe decades even, there is an increased usage in electronic medical records as well as digital tools for care, which will come with vulnerabilities. And there is a certain lack of risk awareness as well. So that can be seen through lack of training, lax security practices, as well as an underinvestment in technology and security tools. Actually, when it comes to ransomware specifically, the main root causes we found for these attacks are, in order actually, exploited vulnerabilities, compromised credentials, malicious emails, as well as phishing. Those illustrate kind of the fact that it can be due to maybe not up-to-date technology, maybe it wasn't patched properly, and a lack of staff awareness for these types of attacks. So what are the impacts? Well, you might have thought about it and you'd be right. The main and biggest impact is cutting healthcare access. That can mean cutting access to operational technologies such as pacemakers or even monitors through, it can be either directly the purpose of the attack or indirectly a result of a broader attack against a hospital, for instance. That can directly lead to loss of life. Actually, people have already lost their lives to their equipment malfunctioning during a cyber attack. There will also be repercussions to like the care at large. So that can be an ability to access files, care information, the medicine needed, for instance, which will also lead to worsening conditions and losses of life. It will also be quite a logistical issue for institutions, as service will definitely be impacted. Like there might be a need for transferring patients to a different hospital or even cutting intake of incoming patients. I'd like to mention as well that it can take a lot of time to recover, to be back up and running. The latest numbers show between a week and a month the time to full recovery. So cutting healthcare access is not necessarily just for a few hours. It can have a long-term impact. There will be as well, financial costs, like I've mentioned, obviously paying the ransom if that's decided. But even if we do not consider paying the ransom, it is estimated between 25 to 110,000 the cost per hour when a hospital is shut down. And there will be costs for recovery, the resources needed to get clean backups up and running, maybe involving third-party consultants for the investigation, the remediation, or even audits. This can go around also $3 million, and that is excluding the ransom. So it is not a cheap situation to be in. There will also be legal costs, which leads me to my next point. There will be legal repercussions. Patients can sue for their very highly sensitive data being leaked, and law enforcement might be involved as well. I know for working with legal teams that these types of incidents are quite the legal nightmare. It's important to mention as well that there is a significant increased risk of being a victim again. Actually, 2/3 of organizations hit by cybercrime were hit more than once. Caveat here, those are the organizations willing to admit, right, that they've been hit more than once. It's quite a shameful thing to say. So you can assume this number is higher. And why does it happen? Well, because threat actors will often share their findings online, either the findings on the vulnerability they use to penetrate the systems or even credentials they might have found along the way of their attacks. And media, when media share information of a successful cyber attack, threat actors might be like, oh, this is a vulnerable organization. Let me try to hit it also. All of these will directly or indirectly reduce trust in institutions. That can mean reduced trust in governments, either local, provincials, as they manage healthcare in Canada, but also federal, as they are in charge of securing Canadians against foreign interference. Funding might be negatively impacted, and what will definitely be impacted is the reputation of the institution. So what are the next steps and my recommendations for the field? Well, first, it is to standardize response across provinces and territories when in the handling of such incidents. So do we, for instance, push towards standards of involving a third-party consultant? That is what the field and I recommend when such incidents happen. For investigation, audits, it's very useful to have another set of eyes to look on the incidents, to have more experienced people to look at how to remediate these situations. Do we ask hospitals or healthcare institutions to never pay the ransom or even forbid it? That is, well, I'm not recommending to forbid it, but I do recommend to never pay the ransom and rather recover from backups, as it is the best option and is the cheapest. Because threat actors, even if you paying does not ensure that the data or the vulnerability will not be reused against your organizations. Again, this has happened in the past. So this is my recommendation. However, I completely understand the fact that decision makers find themselves in very tricky situations when lives are at stakes. It is an emergency for healthcare organizations. And so for the short term, I understand why they might not see it, but for medium and long term, paying is definitely not the right decision. Second, we need to secure Canadian healthcare. That means focusing on actually considering the situation as a matter of national security rather than individual organizations being hit by different types of cyber attack. To do that, we might want to, for instance, create a centralized system for institutions to report and seek assistance when they are victim of a cyber attack in Canada. If this is the case currently in Canada, and it has been for many years, we need to develop further resilience across provinces and territories for the future. That can be done through policies, initiatives for norms, and so on. Third, we want to support prevention and research in this field. So that can be through supporting Canadian initiatives to improve training, expertise, to further knowledge. That can also be done through stimulating Canadian research on the specific threats, the impacts to the Canadian sector, but also broader impacts that we might be overseeing currently, like the legal limitations victims of cyber attacks face currently in Canada, as well as the public opinion, the public trust, the role of different agencies, different sectors in this field. We also want to focus on improving collaboration between different institutions in the sector, but also with different agencies, private sector, and so on, and ideally also internationally to better understand the threats that we're currently facing, what are the norms in the field, really overall improve cross-sector cooperation. And fourth, we want to increase resources. So that means making the field more attractive to talent, which can be an issue in the public sector. That also means giving capabilities to the healthcare sector to have better tools, better resources, up-to-date technology, and really have cyber and IT departments, which most of them already do, but have better ones, have more resources, and have access to more resources. Thank you. Sorry. Okay. So finally, basically what I'm saying is healthcare in Canada would need significant support from government agencies to improve their security posture across provinces and territories, because ransomware attacks against healthcare is very lucrative and attractive to bad actors, and it threatens Canadian lives and the basic functioning of healthcare. And for that, we need to consider and balance the urgency of care, the limited resources of the sector, as well as the security of the systems. Thank you. Yes, sorry.
You mentioned that one of the recommendations being having a standardized response.
Mm-hmm.
were you able to identify some best practices in the field, maybe from some other countries that can be replicated in Canada in terms of having a more standardized model? The second question relates to that in a way that, which is something you mentioned, that of course paying the ransom is not a long-term solution. How have this been dealt with in the Canadian context, and what is the ideal long-term solution?
Yes. Okay. Well, first question. The difficulty in Canada is that healthcare is dependent on the province. That's a very difficult situation that we find ourselves in. It is managed differently across the country. And that also means that IT departments will be managed differently, will have different types of like funding and so on. So that is not necessarily a weakness, but an obstacle that we need to address in itself. Other countries might not necessarily have to face this in the way we do. So that is why I push towards better norms rather than necessarily laws, because it would be quite difficult in Canada specifically for that. I hope that answers your first question. I hope it does. And the second one about what other long-term solutions for sure. So for that, I would say to wait, sorry, I'm collecting my thoughts. Definitely to have an incident, like a response plan ahead of time. There are probably some instances of these cases that we don't know are happening because they are paying the ransom and not telling the media, right? That it is possible, not necessarily just in healthcare at large that happens. That is not a long-term solution at all. Rather to have the other issue is that organizations are worried to report it. They are worried for legal consequences against them rather than if we had a place to report and really seek assistance and we had support from maybe the government or other types of agencies, that could be a solution for the long term to kind of push towards everyone being like have standard like minimums of security practices and so on. I hope this answers your question. Yeah.
In that section, C26, Bill C26, views about other things that has mandatory reporting requirements for
yes. So yes, mandatory reporting is tricky because their legal teams will. I'm in the private sector. Legal teams might find loopholes to these mandatory reporting situations. Sometimes it's mandatory reporting if a specific type of sensitive data was leaked. So for instance, if highly sensitive data would be health related, can be maybe banking information. But for instance, an email address could not be considered highly sensitive. And so because of these types of nuances that are not necessarily easy to navigate, legal teams will sometimes try to find loopholes to not report it. Ideally, or also there's another thing is to manage when you report it. So if there's something more important in the media, you report it and you try to not to time your reporting so it's not front page of the press, right? So I understand that, but the issue with reporting is that we're seeing it more with a consequence aspect to it, like, oh, you didn't do your job properly, rather than like lending a helping hand to those who report it. And I think that's where we should shift how we see victims of cyber attacks, because again, they are victims. I understand it's easy to be like, oh, you didn't patch things properly, you didn't do this properly. It is an immense job to look at all the system, to be up to date on everything. Like very, very big companies with major resources are victims, often are attacked every day. That doesn't mean it's successful, but the reality is that defenders have to defend against everything, while attackers have to find one vulnerability. They have to find one little breach somewhere so I think it's going in a good direction, but I think my recommendation would rather be to focus on supporting institutions rather than kind of.
Just a quick
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Sorry. Good points. Yes. I just think also the other thing is currently the even with confidential reporting, government might not be in a position to fully help these organizations in their responses. Yes.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
Having been a victim of one of these attacks recently, I can totally relate to these issues. Is there a point where we can start to say that this is like any other security threat, disaster, emergency, and have insurance for it?
There are insurances.
Can you get insurance
Yes.
for it?
Yes.
That, because it seems to me like the government could maybe help with that, right?
Yes.
That is some kind of an
The issue with this
insurance.
situation is that insurance will provide you with financial compensation, but you lost medical data. Like for instance,
Yeah.
that's kind of the issue with insurances, and they might like set you up for what's the like Equifax, you know, when they might set you up for like making sure your credit is still good and no one is stealing your identity. But how can someone protect you from the fact like everyone knowing that you have this disease, or that you're, you know, like there are, or that you have a pacemaker, or that when it's known, it's not. It's kind of with the same with biometrics. Once this like your fingerprints leak, you can't change your fingerprints, right? Like that's a tricky thing in cybersecurity, is that it's not necessarily just financial loss, it's loss of other types of information.
That's compared to a lot of other risks, though, that things can be lost that are irreplaceable. And it's hard to put a dollar on, but
Very, very
this is
difficult. Yeah.
really getting out of hand, and it strikes me that maybe we have to kind of live with a certain amount of risk.
Absolutely, and I completely agree. The issue in this case, it's not necessarily just financial loss. When you, for instance, your banking accounts or whatever, you've been hacked, you've lost some money, the government have laws in place where the bank or the credit card company are responsible and you're compensated basically for the loss. The issue in these cases is that it's cutting healthcare access. Like money will not change the fact that you need a surgery right now and it can't be done because the systems are down. So that's where it's tricky, and I think that's why we need to focus on what's the most urgent in terms of cyber attacks. And not to say that it's not worth addressing, but there are industries in which it shouldn't necessarily be the priority. If we've lost emails, for instance, or addresses have leaked and so on, it's not as grave as losing healthcare information, which is why I think efforts should be focused on these types of cyber attacks and preventing them in the first end. But the issue currently is that healthcare is not the sector with the best teams. We don't focus on that when it comes. We don't see it as a national security matter. We see it as just healthcare, right? So, yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Hi, I'm Claire. So I'm with the University of Calgary Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies. I'm a second-year master's student. So I just started working on my thesis a few months ago, and so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So a lot of this is preliminary findings. It is going to be a lot to go over, considering it is a thesis, but I hope you all bear with me as I try to blast through all of this. So I just want to say thank you for bringing me out here from Calgary. This weather is a nice change. And with that, so the digital Panopticon, Genocide in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. So my research is seeking to do two things. So firstly, when dealing with genocide, you kind of have to prove that it is genocide. So I'm trying to prove that what the CCP is doing to Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region of China does constitute genocide according to the Genocide Convention. And then the second part of my research is looking at how the CCP's use of technology is changing the way genocide is perpetrated and prevented. So it's kind of a big thing to navigate, but I think it's really, really important for the future implications of genocide and how do we look out for the warning signs of a potential genocide. So just a quick overview of the case. So this is an alleged genocide. It is not official, but I wanted to go over. So the target group is the Uyghur Muslim population. So the Uyghurs are an ethnic group in the Xinjiang region of China, mainly. They're all over China, but that's predominantly where they are. The group predominantly identifies with Islam, but within the context of this genocide, there are other ethnically Turkish groups that are included. For the purposes of this conversation, I'm just going to be saying Uyghur, but that does include other groups like the Kazakhs and Kyrgyz, and then other Turkish ethnic groups. So the CCP's rationale, why the Uyghurs, why? So they've framed their aggression towards the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region as counterterrorism efforts to regain stability in the province. And their end goal is composed of two factors. So the first is achieving President Xi Jinping's Chinese dream. So we're actually in the second phase of that, and that's supposed to be realized in 2049. And that is to transform China into, quote, a modern socialist country that's prosperous, strong, democratic, civilized, and harmonious, and emphasis on harmonious. This also includes other ambitious political, economic, and social cultural dimensions. And then the second goal of the CCP's actions is the Belt and Road Initiative. So if you can see here, that red line, I've circled the Xinjiang province, and we can see that the Belt and Road Initiative is projected to go straight through it. And that main dot there, Urumakwai, also please bear with me. My English mouth has some trouble with these names, so trying my best. So it does go straight through. And so the Xinjiang province actually shares a border with 8 countries. And those countries are Mongolia, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. And you can also see that it provides access to Europe. So it's extremely important to maintain stability in that province and maintain control of that province to achieve what they're trying to do through the Belt and Road Initiative. So just some background. Why the Uyghurs? Why Xinjiang? So this conversation, I could spend an hour on it. It started kind of in the 8th century, but I only have 20 minutes, so we're not going to start there. We'll start in the 1990s. So as the Soviet Union collapsed and the post-Cold War era was realized, China, and by extension, was experiencing growing pains, as many countries were. So in the 1990s, there were 2 uprisings that were fueled in retaliation against CCP repressive legislation, such as coercive family planning, forced abortions, and many other restrictions specific to Uyghur cultural practices. Some of these protests also advocated for the equitable distribution of wealth gained from the export of resources from Xinjiang to Greater China. Now, prior to 9/11, Uyghurs in Xinjiang were actually labeled as separatists because they advocated for their independence within China and that they had a unique culture separate to the greater Chinese culture. But the 9/11 attacks would change that and give the CCP an opportunity to relabel them. So after 9/11, the CCP labeled the Uyghurs as terrorists due to their proximity and collective identity relation to Islam. And as we know, in the post 9/11 era, it was kind of the latest fashion to label all Muslims as terrorists within the context of the American global war on terror. So further campaigns would then be rolled out in China that would specifically target Uyghur expressions of culture and Islamic faith. These would fuel ethnic tensions between primarily Han Chinese and Uyghur residents within Xinjiang, as the CCP would fuel these cleavages and xenophobia through rigorous propaganda campaigns to relabel them as terrorists. With these new ethnic cleavages really being fueled, this would lead to the Urumqi factory incident that resulted in police open firing on demonstrators. They were demonstrating in retaliation to the unequal treatment of the Han Chinese assailants who murdered Urumqi factory employees. Kunming stabbing and the Urumqi train incidents would also give the CCP an opportunity to blame Uyghurs for the events, label them as terrorist events without concrete evidence that Uyghurs were actually responsible for these events. In 2014, we have the Strike Hard campaign against terrorism. This led to a mass increase in surveillance in the region in the form of CCTV cameras and the building of several check stops and convenience police stations. When I say convenience police stations, they're just basically small convenience police stations that are set on like kind of street corners, if you will, to do kind of like ID checks, essentially. So through the Strike Hard campaign, biometric data was coercively collected. So data like iris and face scans, voice and blood samples, fingerprint samples were all collected and put into a massive database that would eventually converse with China's facial recognition AI software systems within their Skynet apparatus, which I'll talk about further down. Through the Strike Hard campaign, people were banned from wearing traditional clothing, such as head coverings, or even having long beards. Attending mosques became very suspicious, even owning religious material, very suspicious, and could be grounds for arrest. In 2015, 2016, and 2017, several pieces of legislation were put into practice. Each of these essentially tightened the controls over religious and cultural practices of Uyghurs in Xinjiang and expanded law enforcement's ability to persecute people for increasingly arbitrary legal infractions. These laws were also tied to the CCP's counterterrorism efforts, as Uyghur practices were being assumed to be extremist and terrorist practices. People's social media and internet footprints would be heavily monitored for religious material. And in 2017, an app called Jinwen Weishi became mandatory for all Uyghurs to download in Xinjiang, and this app would essentially monitor their phones for religious content. Also in 2017, the vocational education and training centers became kind of standard practice as incarceration was increasing and the standard prison system was not equipped to handle the influx of people. So just a quick overview of the Genocide Convention. Just to preface, for something to be considered genocide, you don't have to do A through E. You just have to do one. Similar A through, you just have to do one. So within the Genocide Convention, I'm just going to briefly go over two of the more kind of tricky parts, which is the intent factor, and then also Article 2B, which is causing serious bodily or mental harm. So the intent is the mental element of the crime of genocide. It's vital to prove this. It's vital to prove that perpetrators knowingly and deliberately sought to destroy a group of people based on their real or perceived membership to a protected group. Proving intent can be done in a variety of ways. This is done generally on a case-by-case basis. And for my research, I consulted with other genocide proceedings to see how they proved intent. And that's how I formed my rationale for the CCP's intent to destroy the Uyghurs. So Article 2B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Arbitrary, vague, it is. Within the Genocide Convention, there is no definition of what does it mean? What is serious bodily or mental harm? There is no definition for that in the Genocide Convention. So again, I referred to previous cases of genocide to understand what that means. So some examples of serious bodily harm can be torture, sexual abuse, medical experimentation, inhumane or degrading treatment, deportation, enslavement, starvation, or persecution. I know that's also general, but these are just other things that have existed in other genocide cases that have been accepted. And that's not an exhaustive list. It is a case-by-case basis. So for serious mental harm, some other examples of that can be the threats of death and the knowledge of impending death, acts causing intense fear or terror, surviving killing operations, forcible displacement, sexual violence, or mental torture. Again, non-exhaustive list, case-by-case basis. So what is the CCP doing that can be considered genocide? So what I have here are, it's very general and it's not everything that's happened. But for the purposes of this, I tried to synthesize everything. So the examples that I've put up here are from a series of survivor testimonies that I've gone through. And these are the events that I've seen repeated over and over and over again, as well as these events have been found in a UN investigation, Amnesty International investigation, and a Human Rights Watch investigation. So to go over this. So these mostly happen in the vocational education and training centers. So that's VTech for short. These are not vocational. People are brought to these facilities when they've been convicted for a crime. Often these crimes are highly arbitrary, such as having a beard, listening to someone preach, owning a Quran, or having extremist thoughts. People are brought to these facilities generally without trial and are held in them for an indiscriminate amount of time. They're only released when they've finished their re-education programming, and when that finish is also arbitrarily decided, there's no true conclusion of that. Reports illustrate that the conditions in these facilities promote illness and at times death. People do not receive adequate medical care. They often become malnourished and experience torture through interrogations, among other abuses. Inmates attend regular re-education classes in which they're made to recite praise upon the CCP and diminish their Uyghur culture. The classrooms are generally equipped with CCTV cameras that can allegedly tell if you're paying attention or not, and if you're deemed that you're not, you are punished. Inmates are not allowed to speak their language, pray, practice their faith in any way. Inmates are also told that while in these cells, if they are, the CCTV cameras in these cells can tell if they are thinking extremist thoughts, and that is done through mood sensors. They're also told that there are sensors in the floor that can tell if inmates have moved out of prescribed positions. Now, we don't know if these cameras actually have the capability, but the threat and the idea of them having that, I believe, constitutes mental harm. While in these facilities, there have been multiple reports of women being forced to have IUDs or other birth control methods inserted to undergo forced sterilization procedures and abortions. And there have been reports of rampant sexual abuse of female inmates while in these facilities. If both parents of a minor are disappeared into a VTech facility, the minor is generally sent to a state-run orphanage, even if they do have extended family that they could live with. While at these orphanages, these children also undergo a re-education program. Reports have also indicated that some children who also still have extended family that they could go stay with are proposedly sent to Han Chinese families who are part of the VTech institution, similar to how Canada would send Indigenous children to live with settler families and grow up within that culture instead. So what I've explained is a very short and general overview of what's happening specifically in these VTech facilities. There are much more horrible things happening to this group of people, but anyways. So now I'm just going to go over the intent and some of the examples that I found constitute intent. So first, through verified documents, it was found that high-level officials have made several references to the eradication of Uyghurs. So just to quote one, break their lineage, break their roots, break their connections, break their origins, completely shovel up the roots of two-faced people, dig them out and vow to fight these two-faced people until the end. And that's from the Chinese Religious Affairs official in 2018. President Xi Jinping has also instructed that the counterterrorism efforts show no mercy. Second, the Strike Hard campaign, which I already discussed, so I won't spend any more time going over that, illustrates that the CCP is cracking down specifically on Uyghur culture and Islam within Xinjiang. Oh no, I'm losing it now. The Forced Family Planning campaign in Xinjiang also illustrates intent as it documents the CCP's attempt to reduce birth rates. So the CCP has justified this as it's seeking to promote family planning across China. However, birth rates among the Uyghur population have experienced a very severe decline as a result of the Strike Hard campaign and even further since COVID-19 crackdowns. And finally, the CCP has set out on a mission that's resulted on the destruction of mosques, cemeteries, shrines, and other culturally significant spaces for Uyghurs. So since about 2017, 65% of mosques have been destroyed or damaged, and a further 30% of other important Islamic sites have been destroyed. So where does technology come into this? I've kind of gone over that a little bit within the VTech facilities, but so Skynet is the CCP's vast network of CCTV cameras. It was revealed in 2013, and at that time it had about 20 million cameras. At this time, cameras were strategically placed outside of mosques in the Xinjiang region and in front of temples in Tibet. By 2020, it was estimated that there will be over 600 million cameras across China. These numbers have kind of fluctuated. It's a bit difficult to get hard numbers on this sort of stuff. But just to kind of put that in perspective, New York has 11,000 cameras for a population of 8.6 million people. And Wuhan, China has 500,000 cameras for a population of 8.2 million people. So the Skynet programs evolved in 2018 to include facial and voice recognition AI. This is provided by Megvii Face++, SenseTime, and iFlyTech. And from the database collected via the Strike Hard campaigns, the CCP has essentially created an all-around security apparatus that is capable of identifying and monitoring nearly every facet of a Uyghur individual's life. Using AI systems, the CCP has the capacity to sort through massive amounts of individual data and categorize people as trustworthy, non-trustworthy, and suspicious. At checkpoints or convenience police stations, Uyghurs need to present an ID that they have been assigned. Once the ID is scanned, it gives them a classification of trustworthy, non-trustworthy, or suspicious. This then determines their mobility and freedom within the country. If you've been deemed non-trustworthy, you're likely to be apprehended and brought to a police station or a VTech facility for further investigation or potential detention. And now, allegedly, Skynet's ability to correctly identify people has a success rate of 99.8%. Take that with a grain of salt. That is from the CCP. All right, so moving on to kind of like the internet sphere of this. So in the 1990s, China's State Council approved a proposal to establish a national information system that included the Golden Shield program, it's the GSP. A subsystem of the GSP was created to act as a filter, censoring wrong or bad information that generally originated from foreign countries, which earned its nickname, the Great Firewall of China. So the GSP can be broken up into 4 stages. The first stage is an internal filter that blocks specific domain names and server IP addresses. It also established a system of identity verification prior to internet use. The second stage of the GSP filters and censors keywords from a database of words that the CCP has deemed to be bad. Many censored keywords have connections to political interests or sensitive events in China, such as persecution activities, officials called on, illegal detention. Eventually, it was found that users were able to skirt around the GSP program with virtual private networks. And the third stage of the GSP cracked down on that and made these VPNs inoperable. And the final stage of the GSP was the enactment of several cybersecurity laws that outlawed anonymous internet use and the use of VPNs. So moving into kind of the social media aspect here. So Western social media and Western messaging applications like Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp threatened the CCP's dominance, and therefore other Chinese tech companies created alternatives such as WeChat and Weibo. At this point, Chinese residents had access to Western internet and socials, but eventually the CCP would ban Google, Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, and other Western social media platforms, leaving China's residents with no choice but to use the Chinese alternatives. The companies responsible for Baidu, which is would be considered like Google, WeChat, Weibo, would eventually be forced into agreements with the CCP to practice extensive social media censorship across their platforms and provide the CCP with user data. Moving into kind of like the more journalism and investigative sphere of this, the law on regarding state secrets was established, I believe, in the 1980s. Just 2 weeks ago, it actually underwent some revisions, and they extended the definition of state secrets to encompass information that are not state secrets, but will cause certain adverse effects if leaked. So that discourages Chinese residents from speaking out against the CCP's regime outside of China's borders. Access to China for investigators, journalists has become extremely difficult. The visa process has become extremely difficult. Even if you Google travel to China, it's not recommended. It's even listed on the government of Canada to be wary of arbitrary detentions while traveling there. So what does all of this mean for genocide? So the first change that I've seen that technology has done to genocide is the means in which classification and identification is carried out. So before all of this was like AI and all of these technological apparatuses were implemented, identification was done on a very manual basis. Now AI provides perpetrators with the means to monitor and identify millions of people in record time. In addition to identification, as was explicitly kind of touched on within the context of what is the CCP doing, the use of advanced surveillance technology in VTech facilities constitutes serious mental harm. The fear of always being watched, never knowing if you're being watched, never having privacy, being told that technology can monitor your thoughts through mood detectors, for example. And finally, the Golden Shields program's impact on China's internal distribution of information has hindered the residents of China's ability to know about or discuss the events in Xinjiang. Additionally, the information that's exchanged throughout the internet on the Chinese social media apps is highly designed and very purposeful by the CCP as they seek to maintain order and conceal their actions in Xinjiang against Uyghurs. Especially since COVID-19, journalists and investigators have been faced with heightened challenges to entry. Visits to the Xinjiang region are highly curated, and visitors are bound by arbitrary local laws that prohibit photography in sensitive areas, such as convenience police stations, for example. Overall, I see that technology has impacted the way genocide is perpetrated, from the identification process, the methods of destruction, and the means of activism. So I leave you with a few photos of people who have been detained in these VTech facilities. Their current status is unknown, and I just want this to serve as a reminder that these are real people experiencing the wrath of the CCP regime. Thank you. Yeah.
So very, very good to hear you identify many of the things that happen in this, I guess we can call it a digital totalitarian state.
Yep, that'd be fair.
And AI will help digital totalitarian dictators do things better.
Yep.
Including genocide.
Exactly.
And the other thing that I was wondering about was the external controls. You mentioned that increasingly there's also ways and means for the CCP to pressure or control or monitor Chinese people, citizens living abroad.
Yeah.
Overall, I have one question. Overall, has Beijing essentially been successful in doing this and not being punished whatsoever abroad?
I think generally they have been successful. This has been going on for a very, very long time. I think they've been successful in the sense that even if you Google Uyghur genocide, you'll see maybe 10 photos of what's been happening over the last 10 years. And I think in that sense, that's where sort of like my passion comes from, because it has been so difficult to talk about these sort of things. Often academics who are quite public about speaking about this, you'll see on many Chinese websites their name coming up and their record being tarnished, banned from the country often. So I think generally, yes, Beijing has been successful in this. Other countries have condemned the actions, but I think also thinking about China as a country, what can you do to make them stop? They are a superpower. So there's only so much you can do. There's only so much finger wagging you can do. And as it stands now, countries have condemned them, but it's still happening. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Thanks very much for the presentation. Really, really interesting. You were clear in your definition of genocide, and it's clear in the convention and elsewhere that you don't actually have to kill people to be committing acts of genocide.
Yep.
Right? But I think that because of our historical memory, particularly related to the Holocaust, but even other late 20th century genocides, we think of death, we think of large
Yeah.
mass numbers of people dying.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering to what extent you might agree or disagree with the assessment that part of the ambiguity about the Uyghur genocide, part of the reluctance perhaps to take a more, aggressive stance towards China by states in the West and so forth, might have to do, and I'm not trying to suggest that no one has died.
Yeah.
But you're not
Yeah.
suggesting that these people are all dead on the screen behind you, right? It's
Yeah.
not the mass extermination of the Uyghur population that is kind of an issue here.
Mhm.
And so to what extent does that make this particular situation less legible to a Western public as genocide or quote unquote not real genocide? Like, did that ring true to you at all in terms of
Yeah.
we live, like all of us live in this highly technologized world, right? And so what you're describing is obviously dark and dystopic, but it can feel like a little bit of an extension of our own Western liberal technocratic existences, right? So to what extent is mass death's absence part of the story here that makes it difficult for some people to accept the categories?
I think that's a huge part of the story and why it hasn't really been talked about widely as a genocide. Like you said, the idea of genocide, most people go to the Holocaust and mass deaths. But like you said, genocide doesn't mean mass deaths. So I think, yeah, that definitely plays into why Western media and everything, it's difficult to say these people may not be dying, but these other things are happening that does equal genocide. And I think that also ties into people aren't familiar with the Genocide Convention. You don't expect a regular person to know what constitutes genocide according to the convention. So the general assumption is that it's a lot of people dying, which it's not the case. So yeah, you're definitely correct in that interpretation. It's a big challenge in proving to people that it's a genocide and you don't need millions of people to be dead. Yeah. Hi.
I was wondering about in terms of Canadian foreign policy, does Canada have an active role in sort of putting pressure on the Chinese government about what's happening to the Uyghurs? What is the response?
Yeah, so I haven't looked too much into that, but I do know that Canada has condemned China the CCP for its actions against Uyghurs. It has also opened investigations into specific companies that are using Uyghur forced labor, which I didn't mention in this presentation, but that is another part of this conversation. So I believe it's Nike Canada and another company are in active investigations for their use of Uyghur forced labor. So Canada is engaged. I guess I haven't been, that's not mostly a part of this research, but yes.
I'm also thinking
Yeah, that's one of the industries under investigation. Yeah, I can't remember the company's name off by heart, but I believe it's a mining company that is under investigation right now for its use of Uyghur forced labor. Okie dokie. Well, thank you.
Charlotte, if you don't mind, we're thinking that might be good to have a little stretch break after.
Okay, I'll just go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Charlotte Hook. I'm a master's political science student at the University of British Columbia. I'm also a junior fellow at the Outer Space Institute. This is a transdisciplinary global research network that explores grand space challenges and then formulates recommendations on what we should do about those space challenges. I want to first, thank CDSN for inviting me to speak today. And I just want to say it's been such a pleasure to hear from the other panelists and hear the research that you guys are doing. I also want to acknowledge that the project I'm going to sort of be presenting on, or the research I'm presenting on, was done on the ancestral, traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. So Oh yeah, the presentation today will focus on Canada's role in space security, though I will be just talking about space mining in terms of space security, so pretty much narrowing it down. I will also refer to space mining as lunar resource extraction. These are just sort of synonymous terms. I'm going to discuss what space security is, what Canada's present role is in space security before diving into space mining and what Canada aims to do and what I think Canada could do. I hope you sort of leave here today with a greater knowledge of space security, space mining, and Canada's role in international space cooperation. So what is space security? Traditionally, it has been thought of as the military security of states. This is defined space security as the protection of assets in space, mainly satellites, from other space objects or activities due to their military significance on Earth. However, there is consensus, both conflicting and not conflicting, other interpretations of what space security is among the international arena and among academics, and they use sort of more expansive definitions of space security. So there's been some consensus between government that space security relates to efforts to ensure the long-term sustainability of Earth orbit for a range of beneficial uses, and governments continuing to promote freedom of access to and use of space for those same human security purposes. Canada defines space security as the secure, sustainable access to and the use of space, and the Space Security Index, which is an annual publication that surveys developments in space security, uses the same definition as Canada, but adds and freedom from space-based threats to the end of the definition. So space security can be conceptualized as more expansive than the traditional definition. It's not just the protection of assets in space, but it can be considered as the protection of the environment itself and the dynamics of the Earth-space interface and how those dynamics interact with each other. So in my research, I define space security as the preservation and further development of space as a safe and sustainable environment. So safe in how we use it right now, but sustainable in letting new actors and future generations also use space. And this characterization comes from the reasoning that outer space activities should be conducted in a responsible manner in alignment with the core principles of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which is the foundation of international space law. So what has Canada's role in space been so far? So Canada has a really long involvement in space. We are actually the third country to go into space after the US and the USSR. Due to Canada's limited budget for space activities compared to other major powers, Canada has to be very selective in sort of what it delves into in space. So these realities have led Canada to delve into niches where they can really be a forerunner and make significant contributions to major projects usually led by the US. So to quickly highlight Canada's space achievements and the role Canada plays, on the screen are sort of three major achievements, and Lunar Gateway is sort of a future project that Canada is going to be involved in. So here we have Canadarm, RadarSat, and Lunar Gateway. So Canadarm is a robotic arm. The first one was installed on each of the space shuttles, and now Canadarm2 is permanently installed on the International Space Station. That is the one showed on the photo right there. So robotics, space robotics is a field Canada leads in. And then in the middle, we have RadarSat. So Canada has developed synthetic aperture radar technology for Earth observation and imagery. So this is for satellites. This technology allows satellites, when they're doing Earth observation, to see at night and to see through clouds. So really useful technology. An example of how useful this technology is actually Canada is providing imagery to the Ukraine military for its offensive against Russia to help with what they're doing there. So in terms of what satellites are using this technology, we have RadarSat-2. This is the satellite shown up here. This is just one satellite operated by MDA, now MDA Space, which is one of Canada's leading private space corporations. And now the Canadian government has launched RadarSat Consolidation, which is 3 satellites that will also be using this technology. And then we have Lunar Gateway. This is a project announced by NASA in 2019 that Canada is a core partner in. Lunar Gateway, this is an artistic depiction of it. It's going to be a space station around the moon. This will be used to conduct scientific experiments as well as a rendezvous point for moon exploration and also as a future pit stop on the way to Mars. The first two elements of Lunar Gateway are expected to be deployed in 2015. And Lunar Gateway is part of NASA's larger Artemis program of establishing a long-term human presence on the moon and then sending the first astronauts to Mars. So Canadarm3 is actually going to be on this space station. It's expected to be deployed in 2027, and it's going to be using a lot of AI. So it's more autonomous and can do more things on its own than what Canadarm2 currently does. Under the Artemis program, Canada is also going to be sending a rover to the moon to explore the South Polar region for water, pretty much. This is going to be launched in 2026. So Canada plays a role in space. We are a pioneer in space robotics and also satellite technology. And also in line with Canada's broader international reputation, we continue to play a supportive role for US-led projects. So what is space mining? So the rest of this talk is going to focus on this sort of newer area. And I'll analyze the security issues related to space mining, as well as what Canada currently does and what it could be doing. So I'm quickly going to define what space mining is, just to make sure we are all on the same page. So space mining or lunar resource extraction is activities on celestial bodies, including the moon, but also asteroids that extract and exploit precious minerals or metals. These could be brought back to Earth, though very unlikely due to the high cost of bringing those materials back to Earth. And so are more likely to support deep space exploration or be used to support lunar habitation. This is an artistic photo. This is not actually happening right now. And space mining has not been realized. Space mining has not been realized yet. And if it is realized, it's going to be outrageously expensive to conduct these kind of operations that you see behind me, sort of billions, trillions of dollars. So the first thing to know about space mining is that, especially on the moon, is desirable resources are scarce in terms of what companies might actually want to moon. And so some regions of the moon are going to be of higher value than others. So the picture here shows the distribution of surface ice on the moon. On the left is the South Pole. On the right is the North Pole, and the blue dots you see are those surface ice. So water is going to be critical for lunar habitation. So surface ice is going to be sort of the first thing I think we will be mining. And this resource is concentrated at the South and North Poles. So this is the first area of competition. The next area of resource that's going to be in competition is light. Light is going to be amazing for solar panel in a way to power these projects. And then on the moon, there are these regions dubbed the peaks of eternal light. These are highland regions near the lunar poles that receive sunlight virtually all the time. So behind me is an image of the North Pole, and the places in red are areas that receive light from 75 to 99% of the time. And then those areas in white between them receive light 100% of the time. So 24/7 power coming to these operations. Also, some of these red areas are located next to sort of these dark craters that receive light none of the time. These are going to be jackpots for space mining, as you're more likely to find ice in these craters. So setting up your space mining operation sort of right here is where you want to be. However, these peaks of eternal light are also very rare. They only cover 1/100th of a billionth of the lunar surface. So one company actually could effectively occupy all of them. So this is sort of another area of competition on the moon. And then to make everything more complicated, or for security purposes, international law is sort of vague on the legality of space mining. So first, I have up here the Outer Space Treaty, and these are just the first two articles. And I'll read them, but the points I really want to emphasize are underlined here. So Article 1 reads, the exploration and the use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interests of all countries, irrespective of their degree of economic or scientific development, and shall be the province of all mankind. Outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall be free for exploration and use by all states without discrimination of any kind on a basis of equality and in accordance with international law. And there shall be free access to all areas of celestial bodies. And then Article 2 reads, outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by any claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. So taken together, these articles have been interpreted by many states of actually prohibiting space mining, as it would constitute national appropriation to actually have exclusive area to an area of the moon that you mine. And could it be done in a manner that would actually benefit all countries? However, the US has pushed against this interpretation and has advanced one of their own, one that actually allows for space mining and in particular commercial space mining. This is not new by the US. The US has said stuff like this since the 70s. But what makes it all the more concerning now is one, the pace of technological development that will enable space mining, and two, the US increasingly pushing their interpretation and trying to generate consensus for its interpretation. So I have 4 steps here that the US have taken to push for its interpretation. So first, in 2015, we have the US Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act. This law explicitly allows the US citizens and US companies to engage in commercial exploration and exploitation of space resources. So it says to, their citizens and companies, you can, go and do space mining, and that this does not constitute national appropriation under international space law. So you're in the clear. It also aims to foster more stable and predictable regulatory environments in order to develop their commercial sector. And then in 2020, under President Trump, we have the executive order on encouraging international support for the recovery and use of space resources. This affirms the 2015 law and explicitly encourages the US government to garner international support for their interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty, in that commercial space mining is allowed, and that the US government should draw on legal precedents and examples from other domains in order to generate consensus for their interpretation. It also denies space as being a global commons, so that these resources are not shared resources. These resources are eligible for a space company to go and exploit. And then in 2020, NASA contracted 4 private companies to bring back lunar regolith. Lunar regolith is just lunar dust. But it selected these 4 private companies to go and collect the space resource, bring it back, and then actually transfer ownership of the space resource to the agency. So NASA would explicitly own this. This hasn't happened yet. These companies haven't gone and done this, but it's in the works. And then in 2020, we have the Artemis Accords. This is a series of non-binding bilateral agreements between the US and other governments who want to participate in NASA's Artemis program. The Artemis Accords establish a framework for international cooperation in space, but importantly, these are not legal commitments. It's only a political commitment. And in particular, there are 2 parts of the Artemis Accords that are relevant for space mining. So one is lunar resource extraction does not constitute national appropriation, is therefore in line with international space law. And 2, that to prevent harmful interference between states' space mining operations, safety zones should be created. So a safety zone would be like an exclusive area around a space mining operation that other actors are not allowed to enter in for safety reasons. But the US has stressed that these zones would be temporary and so do not break international law because they are not permanent exclusive zones. So there are currently 36 signatories to the Artemis Accords. Canada was one of the first. So in a way, we subscribe to this interpretation that space mining is legal. But this is the most forward advancing of this interpretation by the US. So other states have created similar laws. Luxembourg, UAE, and Japan have all said to their citizens that you can engage in private space mining operations. Luxembourg even offered subsidies to companies that went and incorporated in their country to go and do space mining. All 3 of these countries are parties to the Artemis Accords. Russia has very much opposed the US interpretation, said what they're advancing is illegal, said that what the Artemis Accords are advancing is illegal, and it just runs counter to international space law. And they've labeled the Artemis Accords as a blatant attempt to create international space law that favors the United States. And then China, along with the Group of 77, the Group of 77 is a coalition of developing countries that China was a part of, have released statements that have stressed that the needs and interests of developing countries need to be accounted for, which I see as an implication that the Artemis Accords don't. So it's kind of seems like a case of whoever gets there first gets to decide what happens, just because of the ambiguity we see in international space law of sort of what could be done. So what issues does space mining present for space security? I hope it's clear by now that it's probably going to pose several security concerns. The most obvious being that it's going to be a likely source of conflict of tension of even, is this allowed? Can this happen under space law? And conflict will probably emerge unless clear norms, rules, or other cooperative mechanisms are agreed upon ahead of time. But here are, if it was to happen, here are other space security concerns that I have and our research team has identified. So first is the fragmentation of international law. Countries with different interpretations of what international law allow could, fragment the whole regime. And given that outer space as a harsh environment that relies on cooperation between countries, fragmentation of international space law between major powers is not something we want. And it could destabilize the whole outer space international legal framework. Then the next space security concern is asteroids. So asteroids could be mined too. And some years ago, there was a lot of hype about precious minerals on asteroids that we could mine. The concern I have with this is that if you take mass away from an asteroid, you could change its trajectory. And we're most likely going to mine asteroids that are near Earth purely out of convenience. So unless rigorous scientific analysis takes place of if we remove this mass, how does it alter the trajectory of the asteroid? That could have Earth consequences maybe, or just it could wherever it would go. Then the next space security concern I have is planetary protection. And this is more to do with forward contamination. So bringing life forms from Earth to the moon. And for this, to prevent this, you need to make sure you're very much sterilizing the equipment you bring to the moon. And this might seem out there, but there's sort of a precedent for this, that in 2019, an Israeli robotic lander crashed onto the moon, and unbeknownst to sort of the main partner in the project, their sort of junior partner had placed thousands of tardigrades on board. These are also called water bears. These are small life forms that can withstand really harsh conditions, including the moon. So there is life on the moon right now from these tardigrades, and this junior partner did not let their major partner know that they were doing this, did not tell anyone else they were doing this, and we just found out once it was up there. So, there needs to be some sort of regulation of what are we placing up there, what's going on these rockets or up there. Yeah. And then the next concern is the role of private actors. It is unlikely that it's purely state-led efforts. It's going to most likely be done by private actors with state support doing these operations. And my question is, how do you effectively regulate private actors who are thousands of kilometers away on the moon? Unless the UN or another international organization has a physical presence on the moon monitoring what these companies do, I think there is possibility of them taking shortcuts, them not doing stuff properly. My next concern is simply overexploitation of these resources. We have seen it in mining operations here on Earth that companies will just strip resources. So what is the boundary of how much resources we can take from the moon? What is appropriate for us to take? And then my last concern is cultural heritage. So our approach to space as a resource to be rightfully exploited can be seen as a colonial attitude, that it's this frontier that we deserve to go into and use however we want. Many peoples, many cultures, many communities have deep connections to space, including the moon, and their perspectives have not been incorporated into high-level discussions. And the moon also holds a sacred place in many religions as well. So a question that we've had is, if you looked at the moon and you saw a new visible crater that had been built there or not built there, have been created there because of space mining, would you be upset by that the moon space has changed because of an operation you didn't authorize yourself or had no say in? There are also sites on the moon, like the landing site of the Apollo 11 mission, which are seen as sort of cultural heritage sites too. And so how should those sites be protected with space mining operations? So what can Canada do? And so what role can Canada play in maybe mitigating space security concerns or, yeah, and this is sort of preliminary thoughts I have. I haven't done as much research into this as I would like, but the first thing I can think of is just know-how. 75% of mining companies in the world are incorporated in Canada. So we have a huge global presence with mining companies, as there are Canadian mining companies present in 98 countries. So we can sort of leverage this existing knowledge as a new niche we can delve into, along with space robotics and synthetic aperture radar systems. However, Canadian mining companies don't have a great reputation for being environmentally conscious. So maybe some changes in culture would be needed before we let Canadian mining companies take the lead on this. The second way I can think of that Canada can play a role in this is we can't really go against space mining now that we've signed up to the Artemis Accords and this NASA-led project. We can't really turn around and say, hey, we're not doing this anymore. So the next way I see is Canada needs to advocate for responsible practices. We need the precautionary principle of knowing exactly the scientific implications of our activities in space in order to prevent forward contamination. We need to incorporate cultural heritage concerns of what areas do we want to protect on space, the cultural heritage of the moon itself. And so advocating for shared understanding, shared norms, just to prevent conflict. So Canada is in a great spot to contribute to the realization of space mining in terms of what the legal regime looks like. And right now, before space mining actually happens, is the best time to devise rules, norms, just shared understandings of what it should look like and how to mitigate security risks. And why do I say all of this? As we all know, resource extraction operations that happen on Earth have had so many negative consequences. Time and time again, the same lessons we tell ourselves, and yet it happens again and again. These operations have ruined the environment, they've overexploited resources, and they've also disregarded local populations and their connections to the environment. I think the past and the present can teach us lessons, again, about what we should be looking for in space mining. And truly, to me, this is the last frontier where we can act responsibly and not repeat those same mistakes. And I think Canada is in a great place to contribute to this. Thank you for listening. Hi.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. This is so interesting, and I know this is going to be a huge area of growth, definitely, at least for academics. Okay, from a purely anthropocentric perspective, I'm an environmentalist. I'm thinking there's the moon, there's the Earth. If moon mining could displace Earth mining, wouldn't that be a net benefit in a way? Like, I'm not saying it, like it's a choice between the two bad things, but if it were possible to reduce the amount of resources that we're destroying on Earth with resources that we get from the moon, it would seem to me that absolutely this is something that would have to be governed by law.
Yeah.
The other thing is, it does have some similarities with deep seabed mining.
A lot.
Sure you've seen a lot of the parallels. So
Yeah.
you could maybe comment on that.
Yeah, so to your first question, it would be great if we could, use one for the other. However, the cost to bring these resources back is prohibitively expensive. As I said, it was theorized when we first started talking about space resources that we would bring these materials back. It is probably now the case that we would either use them to support lunar habitation or to make fuel to propulse to the next planet. It is unless we discover a resource that we cannot find here on Earth, we would probably never take the time to bring the resource back. So taking one for the other probably won't happen, unfortunately. There are so many connections to deep seabed mining. The most obvious being that they're both resources located beyond national jurisdiction. And a treaty I didn't mention, another space treaty, is the 1979 Moon Agreement, which actually proposes a legal regime for governing the moon and was negotiated at the same time as the Law of the Sea. So there are many connections in between them. However, the Moon Agreement has only 17 parties to it, so it's seen as a failed treaty. And those who have signed on to it, none of them are major spacefaring states. The US, Russia, China, India, Japan, none of them have signed on to it. They do have many similarities, though. The Law of the Sea labels the deep seabed resources as the common heritage of mankind. The Moon Agreement does the same for resources on the moon. The US hated both of those. And so that's why the US did not sign the Law of the Sea, even though they loved many of the other provisions on it. That is the reason they did not sign the Law of the Sea until an amendment was changed to allow private companies to mine deep seabed mining. I say all of this, my honors project, my honors thesis in my undergrad was comparing those two treaties. So I'm actually very happy you brought that up. Same reason, so if we take sort of that analogy further, I think, the only way the US signed up to a legal seabed regime was until private actors could have exclusive resource rights to this territory. And that's because private companies want some stability and certainty over what they're going to be potentially spending millions of dollars on. The same is true with the moon, and it's going to be billions of dollars. And to make it profitable, you probably want a space mining operation there for decades in order to actually be worth it. And if you don't have exclusive rights to the area that you're mining, that's a lot of uncertainty for a private company to take on. So probably the US won't sign up to an international legal regime for the moon until there is some concessions made for exclusive rights to be given. But yeah, there's lots of similarities.
Thanks, Charlotte, for that survey. As you know, the Outer Space Institute a couple of years ago initiated an open letter calling for the negotiation of a regime to govern the administration of space. And fortunately, it seems to have had positive echo in the intergovernmental process known as the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space.
Yeah.
So that legal committee, subcommittee of that UN committee based in Vienna has added to its work program the consideration of a multilateral legal framework to govern this.
Yeah.
And so my question is just what prospects do you see for a successful outcome?
Yeah, so there is a working group that was established in 2021 on the consideration of the legal aspects of space resources. They are expected to finish they're on a 5-year work plan, so they're expected to finish their work in 2026. I think Stephen Freeland is the chairman of that organization. Stephen Freeland is a very well-known, well-respected international space lawyer, also a fellow of the OSI as well. So I think at the moment, the last I looked at their program, they're consulting with governments, so getting their submissions of what governments think should be the space mining regime. Hopefully at the end of it, the group can come together, and I don't think a multilateral treaty will come out of it, but hopefully a resolution at least on some agreed upon norms that could be the basis of a treaty. My worry now is the US is very much pushing for this interpretation that commercial space mining is legal, and Russia especially is very against that interpretation. So I just wonder what the middle ground is of how much do you allow of each person's view? Can there be a middle ground without support of the US? I'm excited to see what Stephen Freeland comes up with, because I think he has a very difficult job of managing all these countries. And I think it should be stressed that, UN COPIUS is a consensus-based organization. It's not majority rule, so all of the countries have to come together to agree upon something. And UN COPIUS has 163 countries in its committee. So getting 163 countries to agree on what a regime looks like, I think would be a monumentous task, but I hope it happens. Yes.
You showed early on the Chinese position.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yeah.
maybe China has evolved a little its position, and I wonder if you see in this very issue an opportunity for US, Chinese, Indian discussions, cooperation, shared benefits, shared interests at all. I mean, Russia is indeed very much on the outside, but I don't get the sense that China and India are. And I wonder if this is something that you're seeing in your research or not.
Yeah, so India is actually a very interesting case. They have actually signed the Artemis Accords, so they are willing to work with the US in some capacity. Though I was at a previous workshop some weeks ago, and we had an expert from India there, and they were saying that India basically very much wants to play both sides. They don't want to be lumped into one group. They want to able to coordinate and collaborate with countries that they see fit. But they have signed on to the Artemis program, so that means they're willing to work with the US in some capacity. China is a more interesting case. China actually submitted a statement to this UN COPIUS working group recently, saying that the principles of non-appropriation, the consideration of benefits and interests of developing countries must be incorporated into a regime. So by stressing non-appropriation, that means no exclusive rights. I think it's actually more against the US interpretation than we think. What is also interesting in the space realm is the US government, and especially the US Space Force, pushes this narrative that China is their biggest enemy in space and that the US must get to the moon first before China. You can read like publications by like former generals saying that China is going to try and take places around the moon or certain orbits around the moon, very territorially, very aggressive, like their approach to the South China Sea. The generals don't really have any basis to say any of this stuff on. They just say it to get more funding from Congress. But it's very much a narrative they pose of we need to fund our space security program, our space activity program more in order to beat China. China is their biggest adversary in space. Russia, not so much anymore. So if I don't think there's going to be much collaboration between China and US. I think there should be. We shouldn't be seeing this as a hostile place. It's or a place for hostilities. It's a hostile place in terms of the environment, its space itself. So it should be a cooperative place. We should be helping each other. This is not a space we should be playing military games or security dilemmas in. Yes.
Really interesting presentation, thank you. My question is related to Roz's in the sense of anthropocentric thinking. Because it does seem to me that your project, more than maybe a lot of security studies projects, really requires this thinking around what is the framework through which you're even going to be interrogating these questions. And three aspects of that jumped out at me from your presentation. I just be curious to hear your responses to. So the first, on your nice slide with the 6 space security issues, that you're thinking of, that one right there. The second from last, overexploitation of resources. Overexploitation, I don't know what that means in a context where there aren't other ecological systems reliant on that resource, or where it's a non-renewable resource. So in the absence of human communities who are being affected by resource extraction, the whole framework for thinking if something is being overexploited to me is not clear, right? That's the threshold, well, how is that determined, et cetera.
Yeah.
The planetary protection and the asteroids ones here are very interesting to me because they kind of raise the most fundamental security studies question. What is being secured? What's your reference object? And there does seem to be some slippage between protecting Earth from space things and or providing for human needs, the resources or whatever,
Mhm.
versus what actually I think you seem to be quite focused on, and interestingly so, protecting the moon from us,
Mhm.
protecting the moon from humans, right? And those are fundamentally divergent projects in
Yeah.
many ways, right? So I'm just very curious, what do you actually see as the kind of reference object of your space security focus here? Is it humans and Earth, or is it the moon itself to be protected from human beings? The third one is just cultural heritage. The idea of the moon as an object of cultural heritage is a fascinating one. That's a graduate project unto itself, but one which I have to confess I'm immediately extremely skeptical. I'm extremely skeptical that any specific cultural groups could lay that kind of claim on an object that is, by definition, universal to all humans who live under the sky, and also that it would matter. And I'm not trying to be overly, capital R realist here, but in any kind of balancing between resource extraction on the moon for national security or international commons purposes or anything, that conception of the moon as cultural heritage would be a robust protection against doing whatever we please.
Mhm.
Yeah, so there's a lot.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
So overexploitation, that's a good point. Currently, we don't have any knowledge that there are life forms on the moon. We think of it as a pretty dead planet. I think the aspect I have of overexploitation is, if we overexploit it, are we preventing life forms from ever emerging on the moon? Just because they aren't there now doesn't mean that the biological processes of evolution are underway to where they could be. So overexploitation in terms of preventing sort of organic evolution would be my response. But overexploitation, yes, because there are no humans on the moon. It is a weird line to join of like, what is too much, or is there even a place where it's too much? But until we have any evidence that there are possibly life forms evolving on the moon, it probably isn't much of a consideration, but that would be my response. Planetary protection and asteroids, in terms of who are we protecting in space, I conceptualize Earth and space as being very connected. I don't think you can think of space as something separate to us. It is very much thought of like common understanding of something separate to us, but there is an interface where we and these environments interact, and space is a human environment. Just because there's not many humans on the moon, as soon as we put the first satellite in space, that is a human presence in the moon in a way, in space in a way. So I don't think you need to I think this is a very general research project. I'm not undertaking this as a thesis or anything, but I think in a larger research project and in what the OSI does, we conceptualize these two things as both comprising of space security. And when we talk about space security, we talk about space safety and space sustainability. Those three things all mutually reinforce each other, and we don't think you can separate, or I don't think you can separate those aspects. So in like a graduate research project, it's probably too much to undertake, but as a larger research goal that the OSI has, when we formulate recommendations, we have both of those things in there. And then lastly, cultural heritage. There was an interesting case of an American private lander that went to the moon that took cremated remains with them, that people wanted their remains to be on the moon. And the Navajo, I'm probably butchering that, nations, I believe they're based in Arizona, actually spoke out and got a lot of publicity saying that we believe what you're doing is fundamentally wrong and that you are infringing upon our sort of cultural beliefs by doing that. We think the moon is a sacred place. And there was this really interesting article that came out after this of, it's not just these indigenous nations that we often attribute these cultural heritage concerns to. Many religions around the world actually including like Ramadan, I was reading, also have the moon as a central feature as part of that. Do these generals in Space Force care about it? No. But I think there is room for civil society to come together or other countries to push for a front that cultural heritage concerns need to play an aspect. The one cultural heritage concern that I think will be respected is the Apollo 11 landing site. And that is just due to US national pride. And I don't think China or Russia or whoever gets there moon first will actually mess with that site at all, purely because of how much the US is proud of it. That is probably the only cultural heritage concern that they will fundamentally will respect and will have the other ones will probably have to be negotiated with them.
Just so interesting, of course, that's not the moon itself.
No, it's not the moon itself.
It's the American flag.
Yeah. Yeah.
I did see the second edition of June the other day, and it was very fascinating compared to what you're talking about.
Sorry, what did you say?
I saw the second volume of June, you know.
Oh yeah, June. Yeah, June. Yeah. I haven't seen the film yet, so I can't speak to it, but
Yes, it is.
yeah. Oh, hi. Sorry.
I think this is so interesting and also from my reference here is mostly like sci-fi, so also Dune for all mankind, which I love, and also has like a gender lens associated with it. But I'm curious, so coming to this from a more traditional security perspective, in the US, so who is the constituency? Because obviously this isn't some organic democratic movement advocating for the exploitation of the moon. So this primarily, you sort of hinted this is coming from Space Force, so this military industrial complex situation, or what are the factors there?
So US Space Force is one. NASA has also really pushed for this. Another big proponents of these are US Republicans. So in December, there was a committee of the US House Natural Resources Committee. They debated the topic of space mining, and they had actually some witnesses come in. So they had an international, a space lawyer from the US, Michelle Hanlon, who said that, the US has to get there first. It is imperative that the US get there first and make the precedent. And I think she said something like, winning isn't just getting there, it's having a sustainable presence there and making rules and norms around what international looks like by us being there first. And the US Republicans love that, I think, because of the military industrial complex. They also the commercial space sector is something the US government is very proud of, and I think is very willing to fund money into in order to keep that going. US commercial space companies rely on government contracts. It's hard to just sustain it by itself. So I think within government and government branches, there is a lot of support for this. Also, space is sort of seen as fundamentally cool by civil society. And so I think that we can expect sort of on the surface, lots of like public support for these initiatives if these like considerations aren't sort of emphasized. Going to the moon is just seen as like a cool thing the US should do. But yeah, it's very much a government push. Yeah, great question. Thank you. Great, thank you.
A little bit backwards. Sure that it's standing okay. Yeah, that's fine as well, but just so we're missing part of this lip. So, but it looks like it's going okay. Wondering if we can bring that in here, still try and get you a bit. And you can control the slides just back and forth.
Sure.
This is
Sure.
all right.
I should. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. And I am Husnain. I am a PhD candidate at Department of Political Science, University of Victoria. And from there, one of my mentors and doctoral committee member, Dr. Greaves, is here. So I'm going to take this as an opportunity to impress him before my doctoral defense. And please don't ask me when my doctoral defense is, because I'm at that stage of PhD where it just gives me chills that, Okay, so yeah, so let's start. So my project is about the origin of the state as a form of organizing political authority, and in my dissertation, I propose a systemic theory of state formation and some of that, not all of the theory, but some of the key ideas that I'm going to discuss here. And for the empirics, I do a longue of the Asian history, and then I come up with three cross-historical comparative case studies of Thailand, Myanmar, and Pakistan. But for now, because I have just 20 minutes, so I'm gonna talk about just one case study, even though I will mostly focus on the post-colonial period. So where do states come from? So to answer this, I start with Tilly's often evoked but hardly understood aphorism, war made the state and state made the war. So in simplest terms, the argument goes that because of the pressures of war in pre-modern Europe, the political elites disarmed internal rivals through a combination of coercion, negotiation, and accommodation, and extended tax bureaucracies that evolved to be the modern states. Indeed, there are many critiques leveled against Tilly's argument, and I thoroughly addressed them in my doctoral dissertation, but one is noteworthy and is the main point of departure for my theory of formation and is the subject of this talk. So this critique of Tilly originates from the decline of violence thesis. So as you must be familiar, where Steven Pinker and others have noted the overall decline in violence, including war, which is the key variable in Tilly's theory. So added to that is the dawn of nuclear weapons, and I hope that all of you have watched Oppenheimer. That's a good movie. So where the presence of mutual assured destruction, MAT, ensures that the major powers do not go to war anymore. So the implication of this rejoinder for Tilly's theory is that if war is on the decline, then the state must wither away. Predictably, after the end of the Cold War, many, including Tilly himself in the second edition of his famous book on the state formation, proposed the decline and ultimate death of the state. So some even argued for the possibility of a world state or even global anarchism, where private actors have more power than the state itself. But it did not happen. On the contrary, we have seen the rise of strong developmental states of East and Southeast Asia without engaging in total wars like we witnessed in European history. So here comes my theory. So rather than taking war as a starting point, I go one step back and search for a comprehensive explanation that could take into account the changing nature of war and competition and conflict into the analyses. Or in other words, if not war, then what is the one key factor, or let's say one tangible variable that could explain the persistence of the state? So taking clue from Wald's structural realism, I argue that the better place to look for the origin of the state is at the system level, whose effects, for example, systemic instability, rise and fall of great powers, or the shifts from the one that is happening right now from unipolarity to multipolarity, or some say that we are already in bipolarity. So these shifts generate conflict and accelerate the existing conflicts in the first place. So they generate waves of institutional development. So one advantage that I am still exploring in the conclusion of my dissertation, and which is a bit of under construction, is worth mentioning here. So for now, I have focused on war or the threat of war or the physical application or the threat of physical application of force leading to institutional development. But I hope that once the framework, this overarching systemic framework is in place, then we can add additional variables to add further additional variable from non-traditional security studies. For example, Mariam talked about cyber threats. So state have started regulating the cyberspace. So they are just state is making itself in the new arena. Or like Charlotte talked about, increasing attempts to regulate space by the states. So yeah, the state is remaking and transforming itself. And so, yeah, so moreover, drawing from scholars who work within the tradition of Gorowicz's second image reverse, and such as Sevagonitsky, who works on the origins of democratic waves, and Simmons et al., who provided a systemic explanation for the diffusion of liberalization, especially after the end of the Cold War and the onset of unipolarity. I make three arguments. So these are the three ways that changes at the system level generate institutional waves, leading to the formation, transformation, diffusion, and persistence of the state. So my first argument is, about the securitization leading to production of space, like the space on Earth. So what happens is that when there's a systemic instability in the system, like we are seeing Russia's assertiveness, or we are seeing that China's rise, China is asserting itself in pretty much every domain of political life. I will talk about that later. But yeah, so the one implication is that, so when there's a systemic instability, state officials barge into uncharted territories, increase their presence, and through interventions generate hierarchies, partition space, and build institutions. So this is my first argument. And the second is resources. So when there is this rise of new powers in the international system, like we see China, so we get, so the partially consolidated states get more places to go to and seek resources for state building, because totalitarianism is expensive, and state building is most so, especially during the earlier phase, when state enters an uncharted territory, because they had to build the technologies of political control from scratch, like what's happening in Xinjiang. That Claire mentioned, yeah. And then the third argument is that when there's this, rise of new powers in the system, so we also see a supply of new ideas about how to organize political authority. For example, the Cold War, as some say, that was essentially a contest between different forms of organizing political authority: liberalism, communism. So this leads me to my case study. So this is a past 200-300 years of history of province of Balochistan superimposed on the modern boundaries of the province. Everyone can see this, right? So if you notice on the left, so when Russia was started to assert itself in the Caucasus, and they were moving towards Afghanistan, they have reached the borders of Afghanistan. So the British Indian government, they started making moves towards Afghanistan. And on the way, they started producing the space, started creating hierarchies, because the main threat was coming from the north. So in the north, they just assimilated the space and put under their direct control. But this part, these native states, so since they had bordered with Persia, Iran, that was Persia then, so that wasn't a major threat. So that they just leave it there. So, and here they encountered tribal confederacies. So rather than assimilating the space, they left these areas just as it is. In fact, they just strengthened the chief of the confederacy and gave them subsidies and some material resources, new guns, and this kind of stuff. So, and they did not interfere in their domestic affairs. So this was the situation by the time Pakistan became an independent nation in 1947. And the other map, this is also from 19th century. So when British India was making inroads into the modern day Balochistan, so they started doing railways, so better roads. So that way they could mobilize their forces against Russia. So that way they were just producing the space, segmenting the space, and creating a different kind of hierarchies, and building new institutions. So this is a bit of background. Okay, so now I'm going to apply my three arguments on Pakistan's recent state consolidation push in Balochistan within the context of China's rise. So securitization of space. When I said that, when there's a rise and fall of new powers in the international system, there is an increasing systemic instability. When there's increasing systemic instability, that leads to increased securitization of space. For example, if we look at Rising China, so if we go through their official documents, so they have becoming more and more aware about their environment, both in the internal and external. So sometimes they they iterate it in communitarian terms, like community of common destiny. We are going to create community of common destiny. And then to physically produce the space, what they are doing, that they are making institutional intervention through Belt and Road Initiative, for example. And then Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And then in the extreme forms, it leads to like China releasing 9-line maps. So they are just becoming more aware, and they are showing the intent to change the space around them. And the same, and internally, like Claire mentioned, the construction of, like, I would say that it's basically through those interventions, through technologies of political control, China is just producing the space in Xinjiang. And in the process, they are creating hierarchies, Han Chinese, Xinjiang Muslims, or they are segmenting the space. For example, they just in recent years, like a couple of years ago, so China reorganized their domestic military formation. So they created one separate one for the Western China, which is based in Xinjiang. Yeah, and from the Pakistan's perspective, which is declining. So, for example, Pakistan's arch rival is India. And in recent years, so when you look at the politics of South Asia, everyone is like, oh, China is becoming a great power. So it's a rising power. But when you talk about Pakistan, so not so good stuff. They are saying, oh, dysfunctional state, it's instability. So in relative terms, in recent years, so Pakistan has declined in relation to its arch rival, India. So if you go through so there is awareness among Pakistani policymakers. So when I spoke to them and when I went through their documents, their official statements. So for example, National Action Plan issued in 2014, and then National Security Policy issued in 2022. So there to balance India. So what they are talking about regional connectivity. We need more resources. We need trade routes. So they have started talking about geoeconomics and development of its periphery. And Balochistan is one of those peripheries. That is the case study here. So in those policy documents, so they have started talking about China's rise, and they think that is a sort of opportunity. It's an opportunity to go to especially after the failure of United States-Pakistan alliance after 9/11 and the debacle of this war on terror. So Pakistani political elites think that China is a new place to go to and get diplomatic patronage, get resources, and use those resources to securitize the space in Balochistan at the very periphery where there's a small insurgency going on. Material incentives. So material incentives, so this is a map of China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, so which is a part of Belt and Road Initiative. So what they are doing that through roads, railways, they are connecting Xinjiang with Arabian Sea in Indian Ocean. So if you notice that, if you compare it with the previous map, so here we see production of space or segmentation of space going from east to west this way, and the same networks of roads, and the periphery has become literally a hinterland. Nothing is there, just tribal confederacy. But here what China is doing, that they are shifting from north to south, so going directly through the hinterland. So in that way, when they are going directly into the hinterland, what they are doing is that new roads, and with that special economic zones and further militarization, because to protect Chinese investments, so China has started deploying private security firms along these roads. And Pakistan also has raised some new battalions and even a marine force to protect this port area. So in that sense, so it's like my second argument that, because with the rise of China, we are seeing material incentives flowing from a rising major power to a partially consolidated states, uh, translating into better presence of the state in those peripheral areas. Ideas and strategies. So many have noted that, with the rise of China, so we are seeing a return to this principle of state sovereignty. So earlier, like after the end of the Cold War, suddenly humanitarian intervention was in the vogue. Everyone was talking about global community, universal liberalization, and liberal values. So we are going back to state sovereignty. So that is why when Pakistan is building these corridors, so this area, this hinterland, they have this insurgency, a lot of stuff is happening there. So violence, forced disappearance, human rights violation. You haven't even heard this before when I said this, many of you. A lot of stuff is happening, but it is going under the radar because we are seeing this resurgence of state security norm. And then the second is, second idea and strategy that we are seeing at play here is state-led conflict resolution. Earlier, as I said, that it was humanitarian intervention. If something happening in Yugoslavia, NATO will come in, America will start bombing. So they will try to impose a solution from the outside. But here what we are seeing is state-led conflict resolution. State is moving in, and under China's patronage, they are just reproducing the space, creating new hierarchies, building roads, marching into the hinterland. So yeah, that's what's happening there. And the last idea and strategy that I trace is political capitalism. So earlier, if you were getting donors were investing in those hinterlands, in those partially consolidated states, so there was a lot of strings attached. You have to do these reforms, these reforms, these reforms. But right now, there is no pressure. They are just pouring the money and a sort of replicating in lesser intensity what we are seeing in Xinjiang in those hinterland. And the same thing is happening in Myanmar, the case study of Rakhine State I do, or even in Thailand, in the southern Thailand, where this insurgency is happening. So the capital is flowing. So this is a new kind of idea and strategy of producing space, which is political capitalism. But I'm a bit of skeptic here, because when we talk about political capitalism, or we say that a lot of oppression is happening in Xinjiang, but when I read history of state formation in the pre-modern West Europe itself, so even that did not start with liberalization itself, like what we expect today. So we saw protectionism in the economic affairs, and then we saw a lot of violence, civil wars. I'm reading a book on English Civil War. So a lot of stuff was happening there. So I'm going to leave you all with this one question: that is this political capitalism, idea of political capitalism that we associate with the rise of China. Is it essentially a Chinese thing, or we have seen this earlier? Yeah, so this is point for discussion. So I am just diverting you towards discussion because I'm afraid of your questions. And just the last thing, and yeah, challenges. So yeah, so far I have given you a systemic perspective on politics of state consolidation, or the rise of state. But again, it's systemic. It does not take into account many nuances of domestic politics. So I talk about what's happening in Balochistan, what Pakistanis are thinking, but we are going to see, if this succeeds, we are going to see what Schumpeter calls creative destruction. We are going to see the withering of the earlier hierarchies, rise of new social classes. So this will lead to social conflict. Again, my second question for you is, so do you think that, whatever China is doing in the periphery, so will it lead to something better, something stronger, or more social violence? So yeah, thank you. Or maybe just discuss it with yourself. I'm going home. Sure.
I mean, I noticed on the map that China doesn't seem to be really connected to Balochistan that much. I mean, that's to go all the way through Kashmir and then the Punjab to get into Balochistan. So, I mean, I'm wondering who's allowing China to simply sort of progress through that? Is that part of the? I mean, it's the Belt and Road Initiative's not going through there, is it?
This China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, it's one of the corridors of Belt and Road Initiative because Belt and Road Initiative is more like global thing. And this is one regional section of that. And here the golden goose in this whole thing is China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is this port, Gwadar. So it's a deep water port. So it's just beside Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Tehran, Iran. So this is like a very strategic port, and even America wanted to build a naval port there, but because of some, because Cold War ended and America disengaged, so it didn't work. But right now there are rumors that especially Americans take it as a fact. So they say that China is building a string of pearl around at ports. So they created that string. So that way they are just gonna push Americans away. So Gwadar is one of those pearl in China's supposed strategy.
Very tribal in nature, no real centralized authority there, which would, make it very difficult in terms of any kind of state formation when you have all these sort of ethnic and tribal conflicts going on. Right?
Yeah, you are correct. So that's what I have been wanted to say, that especially this part. So this whole is Balochistan, but this part is relatively developed, and these are native states, the tribal areas. So, but this time, what China is doing, that China wants to build these areas, the hinterland, because it connects with the pearl. So that way, there are a lot of social conflict is happening. So stakes are up, and that is why, for this very reason, is that China is across these roads. So they have started putting their private security companies, which are Chinese, and they protect their Chinese investment. So yeah, so the stakes are high, but then again, it's great power politics. So great powers go to any extent to achieve their goals.
So my uncle just came back from Afghanistan, and he's helping build education facilities there. And so my question to you was, he sees China mining the large projects there. They want minerals from Afghanistan. I'm sure they probably want something from Pakistan. Do you think that the government of Pakistan in that area can deal with China coming there? Because in Afghanistan, that's a question too. Like, if they invite China coming in, can the government handle them basically saying, hey, we want this, or we need to provide this? So it'd be interesting to hear in that area, is the government strong enough to handle China's pushes?
Yes, yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, so China has a huge stakes in Afghanistan. They are the first country to recognize Taliban. They give them the status of ambassadors and meet them. And they have started funding, they're channeling a lot of money in the mining section, and they're also building some, roads and stuff in that area. And before the Taliban takeover, so there was, if you go through the blueprints of this China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, so the actual plan is to connect this China-Pakistan corridor with other sections of Belt and Road Initiative through Afghanistan. So basically, since Pakistan considers Afghanistan as its backyard, it's a strategic step. So their plan is to extend this, but after this takeover of Taliban, there is a lot of uncertainty. No idea if they are going to stay around. And after the withdrawal, even United States have started, because of the China thing, they have started making new plans about Afghanistan. For example, they want Pakistan to give over the horizon space for operations in Afghanistan. So there's also United States factor, China factor. So let's see how Pakistan responds. So in Pakistan does classic hedging, they stay close to everyone, they rip off everyone. So so it's classic secondary state behavior. So let's see how it pans out. Yeah. Yes, sir.
For the Guadalajara, is it purely commercial or is the provisions in whatever agreement with Pakistan struck to allow, let's say, naval bases there?
Yeah, so the initial agreement is commercial, and the company that took over Gwadar is China's port holding company that does commercial shipping. That's into commercial shipping. But again, Americans, like Claire mentioned, that there are so many actors in United States that want United States to push into space because they think that China might be there first. So there's a lot of chatter in American policy circles that China is planning to use Gwadar for naval use. But like for now, there hasn't been any confirmation. But again, because of advances in naval technology, like you don't have to use it as a proper naval base like they used to do in the olden time, like you block the Malacca or just put like 50 of your ships at Malacca and then block the trade. I don't think it's going to be happen something like that. Maybe in the case of war, Chinese might use it as a supply station or something like that. So this might be a possibility, but a full-fledged naval base, I don't think in near future that this would be a possibility.
I have one.
Yes, and they share it with pretty much everyone. So the Chinese are there, Americans are there, French are there, pretty much everyone. And the same is in Qatar. So maybe something like that, that's supply station or surveillance station, something like that, but not as a full-fledged like Pearl Harbor or something like that.
So let me ask you a hard question.
So the previous ones were the soft ones?
You were hoping for. But it isn't really. If you go back to your very first statement about Charles Tilly,
Yes.
and let me make sure I understand. You are describing your thought to create another explanation for state formation.
Yeah.
And if you had to summarize it kind of crisply, like you did with Tilly there.
Yeah.
How would you put it? What is your thought that's going to lead to your thesis?
Yes.
On what forms states, of which the 3 case studies are illustrations?
Yeah, I'm thrilled that you asked, and I have a few candidates for the same statement to, just formulate it. Like one is I'm thinking that systemic instability made the state, or the second candidate is global international anarchy made the state, because everything is happening under the anarchy. We see the rise and fall of states. We hope that we hoped after the end of the Cold War, finally, end of the history. Liberal democracy has won, so there is going to be peace under American hegemony. But suddenly everyone is talking about concept of polarity again. Everyone is a realist again with the rise of China. So everything is happening under the umbrella of anarchy, then systemic instability, rise and fall of great power. So yeah. So maybe you choose one for me among these 2 options.
Work actually working.
Yeah.
And it may come quite easily.
Yeah.
But I didn't catch it quite yet. So
Yeah.
I was hoping we would get there a little bit closer. For example, let's say I sit back and listen to your presentation. And watch the clock. We have lots of time. So should I, in my simplicity, conclude that you're suggesting that as a result of what China does, Balochistan is more likely to become a state?
It is becoming more status. So we are seeing more presence of state there. So earlier uncharted territories where we have this tribal rules, tribal custom, what we are seeing now is Chinese construction worker bringing heavy machinery and building, what James C. Scott calls high modernism. They're bringing high modernism with them. And then after that, the next stage is going to be technologies of political control. We might see like in 10, 15 years, what Claire mentioned that, like the use of AI or advanced Panopticons kind of thing. So yeah, so the net outcome I see is that despite the social conflict that is generating, despite the insurgency even so in recent years, what is happening that the local insurgents that earlier they used to target the Pakistanis. Now they are targeting Chinese infrastructure, and even in their statements, they are directly addressing Premier Jinping. So they are saying that you are going to regret this kind of stuff. There are there are crises, there are challenges, but despite that, at least in coercive sense of state power, we are seeing more and more coercive capacity, what Michael Mann called coercive capacity. Then we are going to see, we are also seeing infrastructure power. We are seeing this flowering of infrastructure. Maybe next stage might be, if everything goes as planned, we might see social power of state in play. Like everyone is saying that, Pakistan is the greatest country there, things like that. So we see proper nation building going on there.
Thank you. In that sense, maybe to help clarify, hopefully, right, when you're talking about state formation here, you refer passively to the Balochistan kind of independence movement and so on, but that's not what you mean by state formation here. You mean state capacity and
Yes.
governance in hinterlands that were previously underdeveloped.
Yes.
So that's an important distinction there.
Yeah. But the interesting thing is that, so when I do my other case study, like, Myanmar and Thailand, so China's role is not leading to the consolidation of one state itself. It also leading to the segmentation of one state into different states. For example, in Myanmar, in the Rakhine state, so there's an insurgency going on, these Rakhine people, so they demand this, greater autonomy within Myanmar. And what they are doing that they have somehow links with the Chinese. So Chinese support some other insurgent groups, and those insurgent groups support Rakhine insurgent groups. So there, China is indirectly increasing those insurgent state capacity, and those insurgents in ungoverned areas, they have started creating their parallel state authority. And there, what we are seeing that we are seeing state transformation into de facto federalism, like two separate state authorities, sort of de facto federalism. So, but again, it's a state. It's not leading into world state or something like that, or global anarchism. It's again a state. So that's what I'm saying that, I'm not saying that. So Carl Schmitt said that, you cannot exterminate the state. State cannot be exterminated. So he was writing against this tendency to think about a utopian world state. So he was hitting on that. And after the end of the Cold War, many, for example, Alexander Wendt, he wrote an article for Journal of International Relations, European Journal of International Relations, on the possibility of world state. And he says that, history moves in a teleological order. And after those crossing those three cultures of anarchy, we might descend into a world state. So I am actually in the very introduction of my dissertation, I actually hit on that. I say that, no, that's not true.
I'm just thinking, is it better for China to deal with some sort of established state rather than all these different tribal groups, or even for China to try and fragment the state? I mean, it doesn't really make sense as a strategy for me, because surely if you have these different tribal groups who are opposed to China pushing through these economic corridors and having Chinese in their country. I mean, this is a big problem for China, right? The hinterlands, the places where they have ethnic groups, etc., which are opposed to the main Chinese state and don't accord to the rules of the main Chinese state, the Uyghurs, for instance, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, I can't understand why China would be wanting to fragment the state rather than work with an established state that would, maximize its economic interests, which are sort of capitalist interests pushing through these corridors, right?
Yeah, so when I was mentioning about the fragmentation of states, so I was referring to Myanmar in the Rakhine state. So that's a different case. So there, China is somehow helping those insurgents because that is in their interest, because they're very powerful. The Myanmar state is pretty much fragmented. It's always in a state of civil war. So what they are doing, that they are bringing instability by fragmenting it, by clarifying the boundaries. Like they say that, okay, so Rakhine people, they have the right to autonomy, but reach a ceasefire first. Let's sit and talk. So they are facilitating the peace process so that rather than uh, creating a separate state from Myanmar, they could keep it within through de facto federalism. So in that way, so they are indirectly strengthening the present day Myanmar state, yeah, by fragmenting it. Seems like I will be sending a lot of invitations for my doctoral defense. Thank you.
Yeah, that does bring us to the end of our day. And so thank you so much for the attendees who joined us today. I hope that this was an engaging way to spend a Tuesday for you. I really, of course, appreciate all of our presenters today. I really enjoyed listening to all of you, and of course, saved all of my questions for our dinner tonight, so I can bug you later. To the professors who joined us and took time out of your days to support these new up and coming defense and security academics and practitioners. I think that's a fantastic thing to do with your time as well, and I hope you'll agree. Speaking of dinner, of course, for our presenters is a reward, hopefully, and our professors is thank you for your time. It'll be at 6 o'clock at Poorhouse, which I meant to look up the address for you. Yes, it is at 162 Water Street. It's about 3 blocks from here. So hopefully you don't get too lost on the way over. And it's in Gastown, so it's a nice little area to look around if you've not been to Vancouver before and want to take the opportunity to explore. We have a little bit of time, of course, before that point. I also wanted to give a special thank you to our representative from the D&D stakeholder team, Dan Thomas at the back there, who for, oh, you don't even know why. For the folks who were with us yesterday over in Esquimalt, Dan and team were instrumental in helping us organize the lovely visit we were able to do yesterday at Marpac and on the Orcas. So I've heard some people kind of enjoyed that. So that's really thanks to him. So yeah, that was everything. That was everything. Okay, thank you all so much.